Hey everybody, this is Garrett with Earth and Time, and today I'm stopping at one of my favorite museums. It's actually a private collection that's open just outside of Lufkin, Texas, about 2 hours away from downtown Houston. Definitely worth a visit if you're ever here. So let's go check a look at one of my favorite museums in all of Texas, the Naranjo Museum. And nothing says Texas like Texas dinosaurs with a flag and a cowboy hat. And because it's the holiday season, they still have their decorations out. Before I get too far into the museum, I do want to give a shout out to Dr. Neil Naranjo, who built this museum, and this is his private collection. This shows him out actually collecting at different spots. So he's an amateur paleontologist and has done some phenomenal work creating this museum for individuals to come visit, and I highly suggest you do come take a look at this museum. It's fantastic. And it's the holiday season, so check it out. It's a little T-Rex with a present. That's so cute. Go over on the other side, and there's a hadrosaur. And what they've done here, which I really enjoy, is they've actually set it up to walk through geologic time to look at life at different time periods. So let's go take a look at that and learn a little bit about what kind of life was around at the different time periods. I'm standing right in front of this Christmas T-Rex with the chomping jaws. I'm pretty sure she can take me in one bite. Okay, here's the geologic time scale, and it starts all the way back in the Proterozoic, way a long time ago, billions of years ago. But what we're really going to talk about, I think, through this section is starting maybe in the Precambrian, about 650 million years ago, go into the Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian. We'll talk about the Devonian, known as the age of the fish, Carboniferous, named after all the coal that was found and carbon material, the Permian, and then we're going to get in the time of the dinosaurs, the Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, which are all the times of the dinosaurs, and then we'll eventually get to the Cenozoic, which is really our modern, all the way up to our modern day. And here's a geologic map of the United States, and here we are in Lufkin, Texas. Now I live down here in Houston. They have a really cool map showing the geology of Texas specifically, so places like Austin are here. And you'll see it's mostly surrounded by Cretaceous rocks, and the geologic maps, those are marked in green. We're actually out here in Houston in this yellow, so really young stuff. But where we're at in Lufkin here is more kind of Eocene age, so kind of middle Cenozoic, if you will. Before we get into the life through time, let's talk a little bit about some of the other displays here, including this really nice display talking about the three rock types. So there's three rock types. There's igneous, sedimentary, and metamorphic. Igneous rocks, like the ones we can see down here, are all volcanic in origin, and they can be either intrusive, things like the granites we see here, or extrusive, so things like lava flows or the pumice that's right down in front of us. Then there is sedimentary rocks, like sandstone here on the left, limestone, where you can actually see some fossils inside of the limestone there. And you can also have shales. And then you have metamorphic rocks. So these are rocks that have been changed through heat or pressure. So they were once either igneous or sedimentary rocks. And probably the most common one people know about is marble, because people use marble for sculpting. They have it in their homes a lot of times as countertops. But marble is a metamorphic rock. So I like they have this poster of becoming a fossil. And they use the example of a dinosaur. So when a dinosaur died, so he's munching, must have choked on that leaf. He choked, killed over. Once the animal has died, they need to be buried fairly rapidly. Otherwise, organisms are going to start tearing them apart. Think of things like vultures or other scavengers. And once they're buried, then their bones are replaced by minerals. So there's mineralization that takes place, and eventually they become fossils. And that's the simplest way an organism like this poor dinosaur eating its kale choked and died. Okay, that's a nice overview of some of the information here. Now let's go learn about some of the life and life through time and their exhibits they have on. They have a series of dioramas here, and I'm a sucker for dioramas. So we start all the way in the Precambrian. So this would be 4.6 billion years to 540 million years ago. Now, life didn't start showing up till maybe 3.8 billion years ago, but they really see evidence at about 3.5 billion years ago with the first cyanobacteria or stromatolites, which actually started increasing oxygen. And we see evidence of that in things like what they call the banded iron formation, where we start seeing rust for the first time. Pretty cool story. So what did some of that earliest life look like, and how did they know there was life? Well, one thing is, before there was an atmosphere and oxygen, you wouldn't get things like rust. So we can see the banded iron formation here that has a lot of rust in it, but what they can find are these Precambrian stromatolites. So these were mounds of blue-green algae that existed, and there's examples of those in places like Shark Bay, Australia, and even in the Great Salt Lake of Utah today, there's stromatolites growing. Pretty phenomenal. And here's a diorama showing probably closer to the Cambrian, because we can start seeing there's more complex life showing up. But the diorama shows a series of animals that came out of things like what was known as the Burgess Shale and what we call the Ediacaran fauna. So these would have been the simplest life forms. So past stromatolites, life forms getting a little bit more complex, but nothing like we'd really recognize too much today. But then we jump into the Paleozoic and the Cambrian about 540 million years ago, and you start seeing some really interesting types of life. Lots of trilobites, lots of other interesting, strange beings that are out there. Things that look very alien, but very much were part of the oceans during that time. Now, there was no life on land that we know of during this time. Life on land wouldn't appear till hundreds of millions of years later. And here's some of those strange fossils that we can see pieces of that they have represented within that diorama. Probably the most common from this time are trilobites. And they have a nice collection of different trilobites. From the Cambrian, we get into the Ordovician, and we get creatures like these Orthoceras and kind of squid-like creatures. We still have trilobites floating around, and you have a lot of corals and coral ancestors, I guess, and sponges that are all living within the oceans in the Ordovician seas. And here are some Ordovician fossils. There's some bentonites in the back, so those will be those cephalopods or Orthoceras type. You can see a little trilobite up front with a little shovel nose, or a ram, they call that. And then another trilobite up front. You can see some sea stars were around during the Ordovician. And nautiloids, as far as I can tell, seem to be the king of the seas, or the queen of the seas, during this time period. From there we get into the Silurian and some of my favorite creatures, the Eurypterids or sea scorpions, which I find absolutely fascinating. They're basically like an underwater scorpion, hence a sea scorpion. And you can see you still have things like the cephalopods or nautiloids, and if I look down below, you still have trilobites. You have sea stars that were around in the Silurian oceans. And here you can see the Orthoceras, which were these nautiloids, long nautiloids. And you can see part of a Eurypterid over here, and some other pieces of Eurypterids in here. And of course trilobites. So trilobites were very successful throughout the Paleozoic. From the Silurian, we get into the Devonian, or what was known as the Age of Fish. And this is when fish at least earlier versions of fish, really came onto the scene. And you can see a lot more of these armored style of fish. And there's this kind of experimentation on different fish body types during this time. Now, you have things like jellyfish here. You can still see sea stars and corals. It's a nice coral reef. There's some ammonites up there. Some trilobites. I'm not sure about the ammonites. Not exactly sure when they came on the scene. I know they're very prevalent in the Mesozoic, but we can see how this diorama captures a lot of the sea life during that time. And during this time, plants were growing on land. Now, I'm not exactly sure if land plants came out early in the Devonian, later in the Devonian, but you start having land plants as well as even potentially insects on land. However, most life was still in the sea, like a variety of trilobites that were living in the oceans in the Devonian, and a lot of coral. And these are all fossilized corals. Looks like a lot of them are from New York, Morocco, from the Devonian. One of the most interesting fish, and one they called the panzerfish, was a Dunkleosteus. I hope I said that right. And it was basically a giant armored fish that had very sharp teeth up front, and they have some great examples actually at the Houston Museum of Natural Science. But this was known as the panzerfish. It was basically, I think, the apex predator for the time. Well, I mentioned plants were on land. You're starting to get arthropods, things like bugs. So by the time the Carboniferous came around, you had a pretty lush environment. Now, the plants here, some of them would be similar. I actually did a video talking about some fossil plants at a prehistoric garden, and I'll link that up above here. That was in a garden that was in Houston. Things like ginkgo biloba would have been around during this time. Maybe some ferns that you're familiar with would have been around at this time, but flowering plants as we know them today did not exist yet. But there were a lot of these other types of plants on land, and with that, you started getting amphibians and large arthropods or insects living in the Carboniferous. And they have some nice fossils showing the ferns from the Carboniferous, which were the dominant plant type. Now, it's called the Carboniferous because of all the carbon there, i.e. coal. So these were huge, swampy, forested areas that eventually became the coal many people burned for things like, well, their stoves and their ships and everything else they used coal for, kind of, especially during the early Industrial Revolution. Most of that coal really came from the foliage that made up the Carboniferous, that would eventually get fossilized, compacted, and turned into coal. Now, the end of the Paleozoic was actually the Permian, which was a time right up until when the dinosaurs, the Mesozoic, would start. The Dimetrodon, which is not a dinosaur. It's probably, as I understand it, more closely related to you and me than it is to dinosaurs. Pretty interesting, right? You get some unique amphibians, like you can see back here, and you get other types of sailfin dinosaurs. So the sailfins were some of the apex predators during this time, and there's a lot of variety of them, a lot more than just the Dimetrodon. Now, a lot of the sailfins in these Permian beds are actually found in Oklahoma and even here in Texas. Okay, following a mass extinction at the end of the Permian, we get into the Mesozoic, or the start of the time of the dinosaurs. We're actually going to start in the Triassic, and early on in the Triassic there weren't actually dinosaurs, but eventually dinosaurs came around, things like Coelophysis. There were also creatures like Postosuchus, which were actually found here in Texas as well. And we can see a fossil of Postosuchus here. It says it's related to the crocodiles. Interesting. So if the Triassic was the start of the reign of the dinosaurs, The Jurassic's probably one of the most well known, mostly because they had a fantastic movie franchise on it. Although a lot of the creatures in there are actually from the Cretaceous, but we can talk about that later. But we come into the Jurassic, or the middle time of the dinosaurs, and when dinosaurs like Stegosaurus were around, and Camptosaurus, which you can see they have standing up. Pretty amazing fossil. As well as a number of the large sauropods that we all know, things like Diplodocus and Brachiosaurus. Diplodocus being a whiptail or longtail sauropod, and Brachiosaurus being not one of those, but both sauropods. And here you really get an idea about the size of those leg bones. Oh my goodness. Here I am for scale, and I'm just under 6 feet, so you get an idea that that hip joint is probably 11 feet up there or so, give or take, maybe 10, 11 feet. That's a tall creature. I could have ran underneath one of these sauropods. And after the time of the Jurassic of things like the Stegosaurus and the Diplodocus and the Brachiosaurus, and my favorite dinosaur, the Allosaurus, which they don't have represented here, tisk, we get to the Cretaceous and creatures most people will be familiar with, like the Triceratops and the ever famous T-Rex. And they have a skull of a Pachycephalosaurus. And they have a display on Archaeopteryx, which is the oldest known bird in the fossil record, and it comes from Bavaria in the Solnhofen limestone in Germany about 150 million years ago. And this is a replica of Archaeopteryx. Now, they've actually found a lot more feathered dinosaurs in a number of places, or feathered animals. That's a bird, but feathered animals in a number of places now. Specifically in China, they've had a number of discoveries. And they even have another ceratopsian here, part of the family that the Triceratops, being the most famous ceratopsian, belonged to, called Eionosaurus. Eionosaurus, I believe. Somebody can write out the pronunciation down below for me. Make sure I got that right. Latin is not my strong suit. And, if you will, the cattle, or one of the most prominent creatures during the Cretaceous, especially late Cretaceous, were the hadrosaurs. And this is a really nice example of a hadrosaur and the sheer size. This thing stands well over 20 feet. Pretty phenomenal. And there's a little pterodon skeleton up above it. Here's a hadrosaur foot. And I've actually seen some pretty phenomenal hadrosaur tracks where you can actually see these little hoofs, almost like ungulates. So like the ungulates have, creatures like horses have. You can actually see those little foot pads. And they've even found pieces of fossil skin of hadrosaurs, which you can see right there. See the texture of the hadrosaur skin being scaly. And the ever famous, this is actually a Utah raptor, not a velociraptor really. Real velociraptors were pretty small, kind of chicken size more, or small dog size, more like the one you can see back there. This bigger version would be something like a Utah raptor. That's cool. And they have the extinction of the dinosaurs here. Here's a meteorite hanging on a chain to give you an idea. So meteor impact is the most likely hypothesis for why dinosaurs went extinct. And they have a couple other dinosaurs that have been around during that time. T-Rex would have been around during that time. Some of these duck-billed dinosaurs, other types of hadrosaurs, some ceratopsians would have been around during that time. Those were all very prominent creatures when the meteorite impacted about 65 million years ago. So from the end of the dinosaurs, they're really going to take a huge jump into really the Pliocene or Pleistocene. So up until basically kind of the latest ice maximas or ice ages. And there's a series of fossils here. There's a cave bear from about 27,000 years ago, a bison. So trivia for you all, there are no buffalo in the Americas. They're actually bison. They're very different. So when people call the creatures they see at places like Yellowstone a buffalo, they're actually wrong. It's actually a bison. Just FYI, there's your trivia for the day. They have a mammoth, and they call it a woolly mammoth exhibit here. Again, everything talking about kind of really the last couple million years, if you will, kind of the last ice age start. And we've had a series of glaciers since a couple million years ago. And there's a smilodon, a little saber-toothed cat. Here's a woolly rhino, which I've always been fascinated by. Look at the size of that horn and how it's curved. Really, really cool. And there's a smilodon up top. And a fossil horse. And for those of you who've watched my channel for a while, you know, I've talked about this before, but actually horses and camels both evolved here in North America and then traveled away from here. So the earliest horses are actually found here in the United States, as well as the earliest camels. I find that a fascinating story. In fact, Santa's here telling us exactly that story, how horses started in North America and actually migrated across into Asia. And eventually horses went extinct here after the ice ages, and so did camels, but they migrated over into Asia and of course into Africa eventually, and then for camels down into South America, where you know they have their relatives, the alpaca and llamas. It's a fascinating history. All right, everybody, I hope you enjoyed this tour of the Naranjo Museum here in Lufkin, Texas. It is an amazing gem of museum that I don't think gets a lot of notoriety, but if you're in this area or even in Houston, take the couple-hour drive up here, take a look at this place, come visit the little town of Lufkin. It's a cute town, cute downtown area. There's also an East Texas museum there as well, I hope to cover sometime. So take the trip, check this place out. It's amazing. The fossil collecting's amazing, the information's amazing. How they laid this place out, I really enjoyed that they step you through the time periods. With that being said, if you all enjoyed this video, you all know what to do. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Give it a thumbs up. Leave comments. I love hearing from you all. Have you been to this museum before? Do you have some other museums you recommend that I should check out that have to do with geology or paleontology, dinosaurs, or even history? Please let me know. So with that being said, thanks all, take care, and we'll see you on the next adventure. Best bathroom mural ever. Horseshoe crabs and trilobites. And it wouldn't be Christmas in Texas without Whataburger lawn ornaments.